teach us. So when we look at Sarah, what's nice for someone who's teaching a lesson about Sarah is that there are other passages that tell us the lessons we're supposed to learn. So that makes preparing a lesson pretty easy in some ways, doesn't it? So last week, we talked about the fact that through her came the children of promise, and therefore it teaches us, reminds us to put our hope in Jehovah. Isaiah 51 that we're getting to today talks about pursuing righteousness, and we'll get into that. In Hebrews 11, she's an example of faith. And then I put in there the laughter that comes at the end, which I think is a really important lesson for her. So as we talked about last week, if you look at the story of her life and the fact that she was barren and childless, and then she was given the promise of a child, and then it took 25 years before that child came. It was not an easy thing for her, but it reminds us that God not only makes promises to us, but he is faithful to keep his promises. What Sarah reminds us of is waiting for the fulfillment of those promises is very difficult. It is really not an easy thing. So we really do have to keep hoping in Jehovah for those promises that he's made. And maybe like Abram and Sarah, we keep asking questions, trying to figure out, what's happening there, but keep that faith. So we're going to talk about pursuing righteousness as a part of the lesson for her. And this comes from Isaiah, the 51st chapter. And it's important to me to remember that the last part of the book of Isaiah is very much full of messianic prophecies. They're getting ready for the coming of the Messiah and teaching them about that. So if you don't remember, Isaiah 53 is the one we turn to that very much looks to the crucifixion of Jesus. So Isaiah, through the inspiration of the Spirit, is trying to pull the people here back to where they need to be in their relationship with God and be ready for the Messiah. So Isaiah 51, beginning of verse 1, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek Jehovah. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him. For Jehovah comforts Zion, he comforts all her waste places, and makes her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song." Now, I know that there's maybe a part of us that when we look at this, it's interesting that the plea for, if you want to pursue righteousness, the examples that you go to are Abraham and Sarah, which beautifully, he says, these are the rocks you were hewn from. This is your quarry, which means you should look like them, right? You should be of similar quality as they have. So when you look at Abraham and Sarah, it's not an easy thing for us to see them as far as pursuing righteousness, especially Sarah. And we'll see more of that in a moment. But what I want to point out is the beauty of this passage when you relate it to Sarah's barrenness. Because if you begin in verse 3, the Lord comforts Zion. How badly did Sarah want a baby? I mean, it was everything to her, wasn't it, to have that child? And in that society, we know that those who did not have children were often mocked. In fact, Hagar, as soon as she became pregnant, started mocking Sarah for not being pregnant. And it was just that quick that the servant was despising the mistress. The Lord comforts Zion. He comforts all her waste places and makes her wilderness like Eden. What does God do? He takes that which is desert and barren and makes it fruitful. That's what he did for Sarah. Her womb was barren. It didn't work. She wasn't going to have children. But God made it a place of fruitfulness. The Lord comforts Zion. Why do we look to Jehovah? Why do we pursue righteousness? It's because we have a God who is powerful, not just that he makes promises, but that he keeps promises, and that he can take that which is what we think of as barren and make it fruitful. And if he can do that for Sarah after she's 90 years old, can he do those things for our lives? You who pursue righteousness, we have to understand he's looking at what he can do for us with that comfort. And later as we go through this, you'll notice that he speaks very much of the coming of my righteousness and my salvation. What does he mean? By pursuing righteousness. Almost always when we define righteousness, we define it generally in our very quick definitions in our minds as doing what's right. But the scriptures help us to understand that more deeply what God cares about is not just that we do what's right, but that we be the one who is right. So, because when it says that God is righteous, it's not just that God does righteousness, it's who he is, who we need to be. So righteousness is very much about that. So you who pursue righteousness, I want to be right with God. Is that something you pursue? And Sarah says, let's look at that and pursue that righteousness. But the problem is, when we look at Sarah's life, we kind of struggle with that, don't we? Especially the part about doing what's right, right? If you are the right kind of person, you're going to do the right things. But when you look at her life, there's some things that are questionable, right? I mean, twice, Abraham and Sarah lied about their relationship. Right? They go down to Egypt, and Abraham says, look, I don't want them to kill me because you're really pretty. So tell them I'm your brother. Is it true? Was Abraham her brother? Yes, he was. They were half siblings. Same father, different mothers. So it's kind of true. She's my sister, he's my brother. The problem with this lie is that it leaves out an important fact, doesn't it? The fact that they are married. And anyone who would take them, like the king in Egypt or Abimelech, when they would do this again later, if they tried to, because she's so beautiful, make her their spouse, they're in trouble, right? In that moment. Just to be clear, it's not just that Abraham said, she's my sister. If you look in Genesis 20 and verse 5, Abimelech specifically says of Abraham, he is my brother. And this is something that they had arranged ahead of time, that they would lie about this. In Egypt, God sent plagues on that family. The women could not give birth because of what he did. Abimelech was warned by God, I'm going to kill you for doing this. It was serious. So there's a part of me that when I look at Sarah pursuing righteousness, well, she was kind of a liar about these things. And Abram had lied about that also. The consequence for both the Egyptians and for Abimelech's household would have been disastrous. She also mistreated Hagar. If you look in Genesis, the 16th chapter, verse 5 and 6, after Hagar conceives, Hagar, as we had mentioned earlier, looks at Sarah with contempt because she's able to conceive, but Sarah's not. And what is Sarah's reaction to that? She goes and she tells Abraham, I think we should read it. Let's go to Genesis 16. We're going to look at verses 5 and 6. So, Hagar has contempt for Sarah. So Sarai, at this time, talks to Abraham. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I don't think she's talking about the conception of the child. I think she's talking about how Hagar is treating her. That Abraham, to some extent, has allowed this to happen. So I think that's important for me in understanding the context of what she's saying. May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May Jehovah judge between you and me. I see her as being very upset, not just at Hagar, but at her husband for allowing this to happen. And Abraham says, she's your servant, do what you want. And so she does. And that's where you see at the end of verse 6. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Whatever was happening between Sarai and Hagar, with Hagar being the servant, that wasn't right treatment. It was so bad that she ran away. That wasn't right for her to do that. If you go to chapter 21 of Genesis, you see another time where after Isaac is finally born, and in fact, Ishmael is 13 years old at that time, and she sees Ishmael laughing, and she takes it personally. And so in Genesis 21 and verse 10, she goes to Abraham and says, cast out this woman and her son. Both times that Sarah does this, God saves Hagar. This wasn't the right thing to do. Is this what we mean by pursuing righteousness? Is this what we're supposed to look at for the example of Sarah? I mean, both of these are trying and difficult circumstances, right? Not having a child, being mocked, and it was difficult things. But I don't think that we should say, just because we saw these two moments and a few others in Sarah's life, that defines who she is. If everyone made a decision about who you were based on very specific trying circumstances, would it be the same picture of who you are? They're a part of who she is, so we can't just pass over it. And she did act this way, and I think it was wrong. But there's more to her than this, isn't there? When her husband said, we're going to leave the city and we're going to go to a different land and we're going to live in tents, she went with him, didn't she? I often think that if I had ever come to my wife and said, we're going to move and we're going to live in tents, that she would have said, no. We are not, in fact, going to do that. It's not easy for a person who's used to living in a city to go out and live in the wilderness, is it? And yet she did that. She dwelt in the tents. She saw Abraham go into battle to save Lot, incredibly outnumbered. 5 armies against his own personal group of men, 300, I think it was. We don't hear anything that she spoke against her husband then. He went, she was there. What about when Abraham took his son up on Mount Moriah to sacrifice him? Oh, there's more to Sarah and Sarai than these times when she had little moments. So that's where we learned the lesson from 1 Peter that I think really helps us understand the righteousness of Sarah. So turn with me to 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, and beginning in verse 3. This is part of the lesson with regard to how wives should treat their husbands. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So there's a part of me that at the passages that we've already looked at, it doesn't look to me like Sarah had a gentle and quiet spirit. But again, I don't think that's fair. Those are just those circumstances, right? She had a whole life, and by inspiration, she's the example of a woman with a gentle and quiet spirit. The fact that she could go to her husband and say, I want you to do this, and he listened to her, she used the intelligence, right? She obeyed her husband, but she also followed after him and did what was necessary. She had a gentle and quiet spirit. That's the example to follow. And the point is, she's a good example. And we're given these reasons. 3 reasons in this passage, right? She has the gentle and the quiet spirit. And the implication is that's part of the submitting. And it doesn't mean that she didn't contradict her husband or tell her husband what to do sometimes. It means she was gentle and quiet. Do good was part of the example, and do not fear what's frightening. We can do those things. Pursue after righteousness. So how is Sarah an example of pursuing righteousness for us? And I want to end that thought by going back to Isaiah 51 again, because we saw what God had done for her. But there are also clues in Isaiah 51 about who she is. Because Sarah reminds us that pursuing righteousness does not mean merely perfect obedience or even majority of obedience. We kind of put that burden on ourselves when we see the word righteousness. But did you notice the things that they're told to do? In verse 1, you who pursue righteousness, seek Jehovah. Did Sarah seek Jehovah? I think throughout her life she did. Bumps in the road, I get it. But she was seeking Jehovah. Verse 4, give attention to me, my people. Did Sarah give attention to Jehovah? I think so too, don't you? Verse 7, listen to me, you who know righteousness, the people in whose heart is my law. Was God's law in her heart? I know the law of Moses didn't exist yet. That's years in the future, right? But what was the condition of Sarah's heart? That was pursuing righteousness. And then if you look at verses 5 and 6 and 8, over and over, God says, look to me for my salvation and my righteousness. And we see Sarah doing that, waiting and waiting and waiting until he blessed her with that child through whom would come the Messiah. And that's a beautiful picture to us of learning of that kind of pursuing righteousness. All right, the one we all know is faith, the faith that she has. In Hebrews 11 and verse 11, by faith, Sarah received power to conceive, even though she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Again, as we go back and we look at the life of Sarah, we see that that faith is instructive. It's not just a solid thing that defines her faith. So Genesis 16 verse 2, when she's frustrated about how long it's been that the promise hasn't been fulfilled, what does she say to Abraham? The Lord, Jehovah, has prevented me from having children. And as we talked about last week, is that true? Could be. He did it for the people in Egypt. So it could be that was part of his plan. But her idea is, because God has prevented me from having children, let's have a child through Hagar. And Abraham listened. Later, don't forget, Abraham also asked God to accept Ishmael as the heir. He was in that same place. Is this a lack of faith on her part? I want you to consider, maybe the answer is no. This is not a lack of faith. This is her trying to find a way to get an heir. She hasn't had children. She doesn't anticipate having children, But this was acceptable at that time. I don't like the idea, but apparently if you had a child through a concubine, it was considered your child. Okay? So she's trying that. Abraham asked for the same thing, but they're still talking to God about it. In Genesis 17, I think the rest of most of this is back in Genesis, if you want to turn back there. So Genesis 17 is where their names are changed and the covenant is reaffirmed, and Sarah is given that new name. And she is named finally in the promise that is to be given. Verse 15, Genesis 17, verse 15. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her, and I will bless her, and she shall become nations, kings of peoples shall come from her. Did you notice, by the way, how clear God is at this point of saying it will be through Sarah, right? There's just no doubt at this point that the child is going to come through Sarah. So, how does Abraham react to that news? If you read in verse 17, what does Abraham do? It says he laughed. Wait a second. Aren't we all remembering that Sarah's the one that laughed? She did. But so did Abraham. Abraham laughed also. He laughed to himself and he said, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old and to Sarah who's 90 years old? And that's where he says, let Ishmael be the one. Does that sound like faith in God to you? We often, when we get to the part where Sarah laughs, says it was doubt. But Abraham is also an example of faith, isn't he? And in his faith, he didn't doubt that God could give them a child. We're told that in Romans, the 4th chapter. But this was inconceivable. This was difficult for them, and it was hard for them to believe. Genesis 18. The 3 visitors come to them, and again, their message is that within a year, a child will be born. And this time, Jehovah says to them, and they said to her, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. Jehovah said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. I love this reiteration of something we all know, right? Just let's emphasize how unlikely it is that this promise is going to be fulfilled. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? What does she mean by that? Is she doubting God? Is this laugh different from Abram's? Is this the laugh of someone who's saying, I don't know how God's going to make this happen? It doesn't seem possible, but he's promised it. And so there's a sense of pleasure. It's that laugh that we have that sometimes it would be great if that would happen. But it's hard to see. It would be great if Sean could get back to walking. But right now, that's hard to see. And if someone told me that, yeah, I'd probably snigger a little bit also. And I'm not saying I don't have hope, but it's been a long time. Not as long as Abraham and Sarah. Don't get me wrong. 25 years is a lot more than 3. It would be great if that would happen. So she laughs. And when Jehovah confronts her about it, why do we find out she was laughing? She was afraid of how Jehovah would treat her, but because of that laughter. You did laugh, he says. Again, the question is, as we look at Sarah's life, do we see a lack of faith? Or do we choose to look at these things and say, this is what faith really looks like? Because faith is not just a steady straight line, the same all the time. By faith, Hebrews 11 says, Sarah received power to conceive. God was gracious to her. In fact, it says that in verse 21. God was gracious to her. They didn't know the plan. They didn't understand the plan. And it had been a very long time. But she considered him faithful. That's what faith is about. Yes, she tried to help. They tried to figure out how God was going to do it. But they still put it in God's hands. Except Eliezer, except Ishmael. Throughout those 25 years, they kept coming to him saying, do you approve of this? They knew it was up to him, whatever they wanted. Faith, at least in part, is how I think about God and how I think about his promises. And I really think we do struggle because we sometimes think faith is monolithic. But we're really repeatedly reminded that faith is often a journey of valleys and peaks and plains, and it's just not that easy. And we don't have a problem remembering that when we go to the example of Peter on the storm, the boat, come out and walk on the water with me, and he does it, and then he sinks. Incredible faith that none of us would have, and then that's how faith is, and that's how fast we struggle. That's how much we struggle with these things. Did Peter have faith in Jesus? Yes. And then he saw the waves. He didn't lose the faith, but he lost something. But it's not the straight line that we think it is. Practically, though, we don't think our faith should be like that. We don't give ourselves that break that says that. If our faith falters, we rebuke ourselves, don't we? I shouldn't let that happen. If we falter at all, we think to ourselves, well, I failed now. I've doubted. I've questioned God. Sarah had faith. Learn from Sarah. Yes, she tried to help God and do it, I think, incorrectly in the way that she went about it. But when he said in a year, you're going to have a child, she believed. And she received, by God's grace, the power to conceive. And that's incredible to me. Okay, last part of this lesson is about laughter. Because when Sarah finally does have a child, what she says at that time, and she names him Laughter. I mean, that's how big of a deal this was. Isaac's name means laughter. She says, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. Laugh over me, I think, means a joyous laugh, don't you? This is not the mocking that she's faced all of her life. This is the joy that you finally have a child. Who would have said, she continues in verse 7, who would have said Abraham and Sarah would nurse children, yet I've borne him a son in his old age. So, do you think that this laughter is different than her laughter in the tent? After I'm worn out, I shall have pleasure. Is it different? I mean, it's different in some way because it's not the same. We look at the first laughter and we say, well, there's kind of some joy, but it's kind of some doubt, kind of incredulous. And she's afraid because of that. But that's gone away now, right? Now she's holding the child of promise, in her arms. As we look at Sarah's life that's revealed to us in Genesis, I think all of us can say it's pretty clear it was not an easy life. the leaving home and living in tents, the husbands who's more concerned for his own safety than for his wife's, mocking by a servant. Almost all the interactions we see of Sarah, very negative. And she comes off as pretty mean in almost every one of those interactions. And no child for a long time. Maybe for a long, long time. 90 years. 25 years after the promise. Having that child. This was the thing that was the one thing that was a deeply held struggle for her in her heart. It dominated her thoughts and her life. I want to have a child. I infer from everything that is said in the scriptures that Sarah didn't feel like she could really have joy and laughter until she had that child. And this is a place that it's really easy for a lot of us to get to also. We won't be really happy until we get what is deeply desired in our hearts. I'm not saying that any of those things are necessarily sinful. Sarah wanting a child, no one can even hint that that was a sinful thing for her, right? These aren't necessarily wrong desires, but they can be deeply held, whether it's about a job or a career or a house or a car or a spouse or a child or if it's fame. What I'm saying here is, if we're like Sarah, we can fall into this trap where there's a danger of being so focused on that one thing that we miss out on all the other joys of life, that we miss out on all the other blessings that are being given to us by God, that we miss out on seeing what Jehovah's doing all the time. I'm so glad for Sarah that she found laughter and joy. And I think that's a great place for that story to end. And I think that's just a reminder for us that our lives can have joy. And through the Apostle Paul, we're told that, aren't we? Rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I will say rejoice. And where was Paul when he wrote that? In prison. So, 4 lessons from Sarah. Hope in God, because God makes promises, but he keeps them. Pursue righteousness, have faith, and laughter. Don't oversimplify the tension between faith and righteousness and hope. Sarah, that's what Sarah helps us with, doesn't she? Waiting on God can be very difficult. But like Sarah, when you hope in God, trust him to be faithful, we can find joy in our Lord. And I hope that this is a great lesson for helping us. Sarah is a powerful reminder of someone who lives by faith to me. If there's anyone here this morning who, because you believe that Jesus